You cannot compare the Gen X and the Boomer generation with the Gen Z and the Millennial generation. I kind of want to address that with you today. Hi, I'm Courtney, and welcome back to Senior and Living Today. I have heard that the Millennials and the Gen Zers are upset with the baby boomer generation because they feel like they're not getting as much attention and assistance with their young families as the boomers did when they had young families. And what we're hearing is it's just not fair. Well, we all know the saying that life is not fair, but I wanted to point out some things that that will kind of highlight, well, it's not that it's not fair, it's just different. And I want to know how you feel about that. So, the illusion that everything is the same as it was in the 60s and 70s, um, nothing is the same. Nothing is the same. And so making that comparison is it's just not it's not rational. So let's start with the differences between the generations. The baby boomer generation and the Gen X generation, I'm going to refer to as the outside generation. We were outside from the time we went to school, and there was more than one recess, the playing outside. After school, it was playing outside. If we went to our grandparents, it was get out of my house, get outside and play. We were able to dig in the dirt and the mud and play and run, and we did not have to stay on the front porch. We had some leeway to go up and down the block to parks and playgrounds. We were outside. We were outside when it was cold. We were bundled up, and when it was hot, we would not come in to get a drink because we were afraid we were going to be made to stay in. And so we would drink out of the water hose. That's not how things are now. Things are totally different. We had our tribes, we had our groups of friends that we hung out with. And if there were people we didn't know, we made friends and made them part of the tribe, and we kept it moving. We learned how to work together to problem solve. People's leadership skills came out because there was always, the bossy one and the enforcer one. And you learned who was a follower, who was a leader, who was a thinker in the groups during that time. That's how we were brought up. So at that time, a lot of my friends were, if their parents weren't still home, meaning both parents weren't working, then parents were leaving their kids with their aunts or a neighbor or a grandmother. Usually there was someone the family knew that was not in the workforce that the kids could stay with. Now, that was mostly so when they were babies, but when the baby boomers and the Gen Xers were in school, a lot of our parents went into the workforce, whether they were single family or dual family incomes. And so, since the parents were in the workforce, a lot of children became what we called latchkey kids. And with the latchkey kids, we were given a string around our neck, a shoestring, a rope, a tie, whatever, with the house key. We wore it all day long. We knew we couldn't take it off. And after school, we would walk home and we would let ourselves in. And once we let ourselves in, we knew there was homework to be done. And if we were of a certain age, we would start dinner and then start our homework. So as we got older, that was just the thing I found with myself and with the other children that I knew. Most of our parents, at least one of them, was in the workforce. So we learned how to cook. We'd come home, we'd start dinner, we'd start the laundry. We learned a lot of responsibility. And when our parents came home, we had to sit at the table. There was no TV on. There was talk with the parents, whether you had one parent or two parents, and you learned how to communicate effectively with adults. None of these one word sentences, grunting. There was conversation, and you learned how to talk well, which was going to help us when we got into the workforce. So our experiences were different than the experiences of the millennials. Our first jobs were usually babysitting. I know my first babysitting job was at age 12. I was babysitting two kids that lived in our apartment complex, and I watched them all day long from 7 in the morning until 4 in the afternoon while their mother worked, and I was paid. And that is how I paid for my school clothes. Kids at that age were more responsible, and people felt comfortable leaving their kids because they knew that the person watching them was going to be responsible or their parents were going to kill them. So we learned at a very early age to be responsible, and a lot of our first jobs were babysitting, even though we weren't old enough for a work permit. So there is no comparison between the baby boomers and the millennials. It was a totally different atmosphere. So with the millennials, they were, in my opinion, more focused on electronics. They had more video games, they had cell phones. I could dream of having a cell phone. There was no such thing as a Gen Xer. There was no phone. We had to call our mother at work when we got home to let her know we had let ourselves into the house. There was no cell phone. There was no cell phone when we were walking home. We were alert and able to pay attention around us because we were not looking down at a cell phone. So things were different for the millennials. So they had more electronics, they had video games, they had computer games, and they had cell phones. So a totally different upbringing. They were definitely more electronically tuned in, and they had the electronic savvy that us boomers did not have. But what they didn't have is they didn't have tribes. They were the inside generation. They did everything inside unless they played a sport. They were not outside blocking off the whole street playing football or tag or red light, green light. No, they were inside. They were playing on their phones, they were playing video games, and they were watching TV. They were not doing the same thing. There was no comparison. They were more loners. They did not have a pack outside where six kids are coming to the door to knock to see if the next kid can come out and then go into the next kid's house to see if the next kid could come out. That was not happening. That whole setup changed, and they were more isolated, and they seem to exhibit more of a loner type attitude because with those video games only so many people can play at one time. So thing and your phone one person at a time, so that whole group vibe started to go away. It was not the same. They appeared to show more anxiety in large groups because large groups, face it, is not something they were used to. I feel like they didn't get to find themselves as much either because you didn't get to find out who's the leader, who's the follower, who's the thinker, because they just spent so much time in a different surrounding than the boomers did by far. No fault of anyone, but everything was different. So it is not fair to say we're not being fair. We were just brought up different. So the millennials and the Gen Zers, their grandparents now are showing unavailability. Well, why is that? The millennials and the Gen Zers went to daycare. Us baby boomers, we either watched for ourselves or a neighbor or a grandparent watched us. The millennials, they went to daycare centers. Daycare centers were not a thing when I was a child. It wasn't a thing. So you can't make the comparison because everything is different. So the millennials went to daycare, and now they're upset that daycare is so expensive, and it is, and they want to know why the boomers are not watching their children because we had family members watch us. Um, and that's, I guess, where the resentment or the contemplation comes in, is why isn't it the same? Well, it isn't the same because it can't be. Parents now, they don't know their neighbors. So you can't leave your kid with a neighbor because you don't know what you're getting. You can't let your kids walk home latchkey because somebody may follow them. That's different. We used to have neighborhood watches. I don't see that anymore at all. Again, it's different. It's not that it's unfair, it's just different. So, um, kids today, you worry about them even if they're not children. You worry about adult women, being stalked and followed, etc. So you definitely cannot make the comparison about why there is not the same standard as there used to be. Everything is different. So millennials, they came home, they did their homework, either while they were at daycare or when they came home and their parents were making dinner. So they also lost the edge on cooking and doing as many chores because the whole setup was different. So part of that responsibility factor was removed for them. So I found that it seems like more millennials, when they got home and it was time for dinner, the TV was on and everybody was eating dinner and watching TV instead of talking. So there was more of a communication breakdown as well. So that's to be considered. Millennials, their parents had a little bit more money, and so those children were able to go to summer camps where us baby boomers and Gen Xers, we didn't go to summer camp. We gathered and played together in the streets, hot outside. That's all there was. Nobody could afford, that I knew, could afford going to summer camp. It was not a everyday thing. So that is something to be considered. It's not unfair, it's just different. Millennials, their first jobs were more fast food. They were more of the fast food industry. They got their work permits at 15, 16, and then they started working, where the baby boomers and the Gen Xers were working earlier, a lot earlier, whether it was, just cutting someone's grass or, like I said, babysitting. So we got like a 4 year head start being in the work industry. So the millennials, they could cook less. They were more into fast food, hot pockets, Pop Tarts, that sort of thing. And they were more isolated. So again, not unfair, just different, just different. So now the millennials are parents and they're wanting more assistance and they want to know why boomers are not there to help them. And the simple answer is boomers are still working. Boomers are still working. While you're saying it's not fair, boomers and Gen Xers are still working. You've seen the price of everything. You know how expensive everything is. And although we have grandchildren, many of us have grandchildren and would like to care for them, we can't quit our jobs to care for your children, and we can't make ends meet if we don't work. We are at an age now where we are expected to work until we are almost 70 years old. And so to do that, how can we do that and watch our grandchildren? So that is, it's not unfair. It just is. It just is. Grandparents are still working. Everything is expensive. Daycare is expensive, but so is groceries and property tax. And millennials um, are not understanding that the boomers are panicked about how are they going to retire? When can they retire? So, although we would like to help our grandchildren and our children, how can we afford to? That's the real question. That is the question. How can we afford to do that? And my suggestion would be it sounds simple. I realize it's not, but you might want to consider a shift change. And what I mean by that is if you work day shift and you want your parents to try to be able to help out with your kids, consider changing your schedule. Consider changing your schedule to a swing or a graveyard shift. So, to see if that would make it possible that you would not need as much daycare. For me, for an example, I work daycare. If my children work swing or graveyard, I could work my day shift. And then when they're going to swing or graveyard, I could watch their children. I could give them dinner. I could put them to bed. And then when my adult children got off work, they could take over with their kids. I just think because things are different, some concessions are going to need to be made if you want assistance. If you want to work as a family unit, then you're going to have to adjust as a family. What does that mean as things are so expensive? Does that mean generational living? Maybe so. Maybe so. If you have a large house and you have a grandparent and you have the parents with children, then wouldn't that be perfect when the kids came home from school? Then maybe a grandparent could be there. I know we have gone through a period where a lot of the grandparents are in 55 and up places where they're living their best life. But as things are getting more expensive, I see that going away. I don't see people being able to afford that. I see generational living having to become an option for families to live their best life. So, what is it going to take for your family to be able to work together and you not feel like your parents aren't there to help you? Everyone's being unfair. What can you do to make it work? Um, I know changing shifts, it's inconvenient, but it could be financially, it could be a huge win. So, what are you willing to do instead of just saying it's unfair? Come up with a plan. What could you what could you do? It's not that it's not fair. It's just that everything is different. It's everything is different. Everything is more expensive. Families are more spread out, so it's harder for them to help you. People don't have community like they used to, where the lady next door could watch your kids for 2 hours in between family coming and going, or to keep your kids after school until you get off work. What concessions are you willing to make it more fair? It's very hard for seniors living today. It's different than it was 40 years ago, and everyone is going to have to make amends and adjust. Decide what you're willing to do, decide how much you're willing to give. Sit down and talk with your kids who may be struggling, and as seniors, we may be struggling. So get together and find out, what is it? What would help? If a grandparent watches the kid and you were giving daycare 1,200 a month, can you give your parents 600 a month? That helps them and it helps you, and your kids are with family. What can you do? Sit down and think about all the things and come up with a plan. I hope that this has given you something to think about. I hope that you will talk about it with your friends, and things will become easier for the millennials and for the seniors living today. We all need a break. What can we do to help each other out? So think about that. Do not forget, on this channel, we have the Ask a Question segment. So submit your questions either by email or put your question down below in the comments. We have the Super Senior segment. So email me information about a senior that you think is super, and I will talk about them on the channel. Do not forget to be prepared and get yourself and those that you care about the Living Legacy Planner. It is available on Amazon, and I think that everyone who is a caregiver or who lives alone and considers themselves independent should have one. So get the Living Legacy Planner. It is available right now. Do not forget to like and subscribe to this channel. If you haven't subscribed already, why not? Just reach over right now while you're watching me and push the button. And if you're not sure if you did it, push it 3 times. Okay? I look forward to seeing you next time right here on Senior and Living Today. Take care.